The rusted padlock fell to the ground with a metallic clank that echoed through the Utah Valley. Sarah Whitman stood before her grandmother's forbidden barn, bolt cutters trembling in her hands. For 32 years of her life, this weathered red structure had been absolutely off-limits. Grandma Esther would fly into a rage if anyone even walked near it, claiming it was just old farm equipment that was too dangerous for curious minds. But Sarah wasn't the same frightened child who once cowered at her grandmother's warnings. As a federal investigator specializing in cold cases, she recognized evasion when she saw it. The way Grandma Esther's eyes would dart away, how she'd quickly change the subject, the way she'd check and double-check those locks every single day until her death last week. Now, with the estate in probate and the family gathered to settle affairs, Sarah was the only one brave enough to find out what her devout Mormon grandmother had been hiding for 6 decades. As the barn door creaked open and Sarah's flashlight pierced the darkness, she gasped. What she saw would shatter everything she thought she knew about the woman who raised her. But was Sarah prepared for a truth that could destroy her family's faith forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The musty air hit her like a physical wall, thick with decades of secrets and silence. Sarah stepped inside, her flashlight beam dancing across what should have been simple farm equipment. Instead, she found herself in what appeared to be a carefully preserved living space. A small bed sat against the far wall, its quilt hand-stitched in a pattern Sarah didn't recognize. Not the traditional Mormon designs she'd grown up seeing at church gatherings and Relief Society meetings. This was different, geometric symbols that seemed almost Native American in origin. Her breath caught as the light revealed a wooden table covered with journals, their leather bindings cracked with age. Some were thick, others slim, but all bore the same careful handwriting she recognized as her grandmother's. Next to them sat a collection of photographs in frames, but these weren't the family photos that decorated Grandma Esther's house. Sarah picked up the nearest frame with shaking hands. The black and white photograph showed a young woman who looked remarkably like Esther, standing beside a man in traditional Native American dress. Behind them, children played in what appeared to be a reservation setting. The woman in the photo wore simple clothes and a radiant smile Sarah had never seen on her grandmother's face. "What the hell?" she whispered, setting the frame down carefully. More photographs revealed the same story. Esther, definitely Esther, but living a completely different life. Here she was grinding corn with elderly Native women. There she stood holding a baby that clearly wasn't any of Sarah's known relatives. In another, she danced around a fire with people who looked nothing like the pale, conservative Mormon community Sarah had always known as family. The journals beckoned. Sarah opened the first one, dated 1963, the year before her grandfather supposedly met Esther at a church social in Salt Lake City. "My heart breaks to leave the reservation." Esther's familiar handwriting began, "But Joseph says we can make a new life. He promises no one will ever know about my past, about who I really am. He says it's the only way I can be truly saved, truly clean. But how can I be clean when I'm washing away everything that made me whole?" Sarah's legs gave out. She sank onto a dusty crate, mind reeling. Her grandmother hadn't been the lifelong Mormon convert she'd claimed. She'd been, what, Native American? Living on a reservation? The official family story was gospel truth in their household. Esther Blackwood, orphaned young, found faith and family when she met Joseph Whitman at a church dance. They'd built this farm together, raised 3 children in the church, never missed a Sunday service in 60 years. But the evidence surrounding Sarah told a different story entirely. She flipped through more journal entries, each one peeling back another layer of the lie. References to a Navajo grandmother, grief over leaving siblings behind, detailed accounts of traditional ceremonies and beliefs that would have been considered heretical in their Mormon community. And then, the entry that made Sarah's blood run cold. Joseph says if anyone ever finds out the truth, it would destroy everything. Our children standing in the community, their temple marriages, their eternal salvation. He's right, of course. but sometimes I wonder if destroying the lie might be worth saving what's left of my soul." Sarah heard footsteps approaching outside. Her cousin Mark's voice carried across the yard, calling her name. The rest of the family was looking for her, wondering where she'd disappeared to during the estate planning meeting. She glanced around the barn with new eyes, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't just a storage space. This was a shrine to the woman her grandmother had been forced to abandon, and Sarah was the only one who knew. The funeral reception stretched on like a wake from another century. Sarah Whitman stood in the corner of the church fellowship hall, watching relatives she barely recognized pick over casseroles and share memories of her grandmother that felt sanitized, almost scripted. Everyone spoke of Esther's devotion to the church, her perfect attendance record, her legendary funeral potatoes. No one mentioned the barn. "She was such a pillar of faith," Aunt Marlene was saying to a cluster of grey-haired women. "Never missed a Sunday, never complained, even when Uncle Frank was deployed for 2 years. Sarah's mother, Rebecca, nodded along, dabbing her eyes with tissues that had seen too much use today. She'd been crying since yesterday, when they'd found Grandma Esther collapsed in her garden, soil still under her fingernails, tomatoes scattered around her like fallen prayers. "Sarah, honey, come eat something." Her mother's voice carried that particular Mormon tone of gentle insistence that brooked no argument. But Sarah couldn't stomach another bite of green bean casserole or another story about Grandma Esther's righteousness. She kept thinking about that barn, sitting there on the property like a red wound against the landscape. For 26 years, she'd wondered what was inside. Now, with Grandma Esther gone, the wondering had transformed into something sharper, more urgent. "I need some air," Sarah murmured, slipping out through the back door of the fellowship hall. The Idaho evening was crisp for late September, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant smell of farm equipment. Sarah pulled out her phone and called her husband. "How's it going?" David's voice was warm, familiar, a lifeline back to her real life in Portland. Surreal. Everyone's acting like she was Mother Teresa, but... Sarah paused, looking across the parking lot toward the mountains. "I keep thinking about that barn, David, the one she never let anyone into. Grandma Esther made my mom promise to never go in there, made her swear on the Book of Mormon when Mom was 12. What kind of grandmother does that?" David was quiet for a moment. "Maybe there's nothing in there, Sarah. Maybe it was just, I don't know, her private space? For 60 years? With padlocks and threats?" Sarah kicked at a loose piece of gravel. "My whole childhood, she'd watch us kids like a hawk whenever we played near that barn. She'd get this look in her eyes, like she was terrified. What are you thinking?" Sarah knew what she was thinking, but saying it out loud felt like crossing a line. "I'm thinking, I'm going to find out what's in there." "Sarah?" "She's gone, David. Whatever she was protecting or hiding or ashamed of, she's gone. And I'm the only one in this family who seems to care about the truth." After they hung up, Sarah stood in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, watching the light fade behind the mountains. Inside, she could hear the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter that sounded too loud, too forced. Grief made people perform their emotions differently. "Mom, I've been thinking about the property," Sarah said carefully. "What's going to happen to it?" Rebecca paused in her Tupperware sorting. "Well, the will reading is tomorrow, but I imagine it'll come to me." "Why?" "I was thinking about staying for a few extra days, maybe helping you go through things. What about the outbuildings? The barn and the old shed?" Something flickered across her mother's expression, quick, but Sarah caught it. Fear. The same look Grandma Esther used to get. "I suppose we'll need to deal with those too," Rebecca said slowly. "Though I don't know what's in them. Mother always kept them locked. She never told you what was in the barn. She said it was just old farming equipment, things from when Grandpa was alive." Rebecca's hands moved restlessly among the containers. "Sarah, I made a promise to my mother. We shouldn't go poking around where we're not wanted. But she's gone now, Mom. That doesn't mean the promise is gone." Sarah watched her mother's face, seeing decades of unquestioned obedience written in the lines around her eyes. Rebecca had been trained, just like Sarah had been trained, to not ask questions, to accept what they were told, to be grateful and faithful and quiet. But Sarah had left Idaho at 18 for a reason. She'd spent 8 years building a life that was hers, making choices that were hers, asking questions that mattered to her. "I understand," she told her mother, which wasn't quite a lie. She understood the conditioning. She just wasn't going to let it stop her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Sarah approached the barn with renewed determination. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with possibilities about what Grandmother Esther had hidden for 6 decades. The weight of the crowbar in her hands felt both foreign and necessary. The padlock was older than she'd initially noticed, its brass surface green with patina. Sarah wedged the crowbar behind the metal hasp and pulled. The wood splintered with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the empty fields. Her heart hammered as she looked around, half expecting to see Esther's disapproving figure materializing from the morning mist. The barn door groaned as it swung open, releasing the smell of decades-old hay and something else, something medicinal and sharp that made her nose wrinkle. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that cut through the darkness. Sarah's eyes adjusted slowly. The barn appeared ordinary at first glance, stalls along one wall, a hayloft above, farming tools hanging from hooks. But as she stepped deeper inside, she noticed the inconsistencies. The floor was too clean for a working barn. The hay bales looked undisturbed, arranged more for concealment than storage. At the far end, partially hidden behind a stack of feed sacks, stood a wooden cabinet that didn't belong. Sarah moved toward it, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of old hay scattered across the floor. The cabinet was painted white, like something from a hospital or clinic. Inside the cabinet, glass vials lined the shelves, their labels faded but still legible. Sarah recognized some of the names: morphine, chloroform, laudanum. Below the vials sat a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. Her hands trembled as she opened the book. The first entry was dated September 1963, written in Esther's careful script. And Mrs. Catherine Henley. 7th month. Complications. No husband to speak of. Resolved successfully. Payment received. Sarah's breath caught. She flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry in the same format: names, dates, cryptic notes about payments and procedures. Some entries included small sketches, diagrams that made Sarah's stomach turn as their meaning became clear. A loose photograph fell from between the pages. Sarah picked it up, her hands shaking. It showed a younger Esther standing beside a metal table in what looked like this very barn, though it had been configured differently then. Medical equipment surrounded her, instruments that had no place in rural Mormon Utah during the 1960s. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, sinking onto an overturned crate. Her grandmother, the woman who'd taught her about virtue and righteousness, who'd quoted scripture during family dinners and insisted on modest dress, had been performing illegal abortions for decades. Sarah continued reading, each entry adding another crack to the foundation of everything she'd believed about her family. The ledger spanned 23 years, from 1963 to 1986, hundreds of names, thousands of dollars in payments, carefully recorded, and what appeared to be donated to various charities. Some entries were more detailed than others. Sarah read about desperate women who'd traveled from as far as Nevada and Colorado, college students, married women with too many children already, young girls barely out of childhood themselves. Esther had helped them all, asking no questions about their circumstances. Near the back of the ledger, Sarah found a section that made her heart stop, a list of complications. 3 women who'd required hospitalization afterward, one who'd nearly died from infection, and at the very bottom, in Esther's increasingly shaky handwriting, and Margaret Thorne. February 1986, hemorrhaging, could not be saved, may God forgive me. Sarah slammed the ledger shut, but she couldn't unsee what she'd read. Her grandmother hadn't just been providing illegal medical procedures, someone had died. A woman named Margaret Thorne had bled to death in this barn, and Esther had kept it secret for 37 years. The barn suddenly felt suffocating. Sarah stumbled toward the door, clutching the ledger against her chest. Outside, she gulped the fresh air and tried to process what she'd discovered. The woman who'd raised her to believe in absolute moral certainties had lived a double life that violated everything their church taught. But as the initial shock began to fade, other thoughts crept in. Sarah remembered whispered conversations at church about girls who'd gone to visit relatives for extended periods. She thought about the desperate gratitude in some of the ledger entries, the thank you notes tucked between pages expressing relief and blessing Esther's compassion. Her phone buzzed with a text from her cousin David, and family meeting tonight at 7. Mom wants to discuss estate details. Can you make it? Sarah stared at the message, then at the ledger in her hands. What was she supposed to do with this information? How could she sit across from her aunts and uncles and pretend she hadn't just discovered that their saintly mother had been performing illegal procedures that resulted in at least one death? The secret that had been buried with Esther was now hers to carry, and Sarah had no idea whether revealing the truth would honor her grandmother's memory or destroy it completely. The rusted lock broke easier than Sarah expected, falling to the barn floor with a hollow clang that seemed to echo through 60 years of silence. Her hands trembled as she pulled the heavy wooden door open, its hinges protesting with a groan that made her glance nervously back toward the house. But the windows remained dark, her family still lost in grief and funeral preparations. The smell hit her first, musty air thick with decades of dust and something else, something metallic and wrong. Sarah fumbled for her phone's flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the darkness to reveal shapes that made no immediate sense. As her eyes adjusted, the barn's secrets began to emerge from the shadows like ghosts materializing in a seance. Against the far wall stood a workbench covered with glass bottles and metal instruments that gleamed dully in the phone's light. Sarah stepped closer, her footsteps muffled by a thick layer of dust and debris. The bottles contained liquids of various colors, amber, clear, dark red that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Labels in her grandmother's precise handwriting marked each container: tincture of foxglove, concentrated hemlock, oleander extract. Sarah's breath caught. These weren't the herbs and remedies Grandma Esther had been known for in the community. These were poisons. Her light swept across the workbench, revealing leather-bound journals stacked beside mortar and pestles stained with residue from whatever compounds had been ground there. Sarah opened the topmost journal with shaking fingers, recognizing immediately her grandmother's meticulous script. June 15, 1963, the first entry read, "Brother Morrison continues to ask questions about the temple records. His persistence is becoming problematic. A small amount of the foxglove preparation in his evening tea should induce a heart episode. At his age, no one will question it." The phone nearly slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers. She forced herself to keep reading, each entry more damning than the last. Names she recognized from family stories, pillars of the local Mormon community who had died suddenly over the decades, all of them mentioned in these pages with clinical detachment, their deaths planned and executed with the precision of a scientist. July 3, 1963, Brother Morrison passed peacefully in his sleep. Sister Morrison expressed gratitude for my presence during his final hours. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sarah stumbled backward, knocking over a wooden crate that spilled its contents across the barn floor. Photographs scattered in the dust, dozens of them, yellowed with age. She knelt and gathered them with trembling hands, the images becoming clear in her phone's light. The first showed a much younger Esther Whitman standing beside a man Sarah didn't recognize, both of them smiling at the camera. But it was the background that made Sarah's blood freeze. Behind them, partially visible through an open doorway, was this very barn, but decades ago, when it had clearly been in active use. Another photograph showed the same man, but this time he was lying still, his eyes closed, while Grandma Esther stood over him with something in her hand. A syringe, perhaps, or a small vial. The clinical nature of the image, as if it were documentation rather than a snapshot, made Sarah's stomach lurch. More photos revealed the same pattern. People Sarah didn't recognize, some alive and smiling with Esther, others captured in what could only be their final moments. The dates penciled on the backs spanned decades, from the early 1960s well into the 1990s. At the bottom of the crate, Sarah found a metal box locked with a small padlock. She used a screwdriver from the workbench to pry it open, revealing documents that made her legs give out entirely. She sank to the barn floor, papers scattered around her like accusations. Death certificates, insurance policies, wills, all bearing the signatures of people whose photographs lay scattered in the dust, all listing Esther Whitman as beneficiary or witness. The money trail was methodical, deliberate, never enough to raise suspicion, but accumulated over 60 years, it represented a fortune. But it was the final document that broke something inside Sarah's chest. A marriage certificate dated 1962, showing Esther's marriage to a man named William Sterling, dated 3 years after her supposed marriage to grandfather James. Beneath it, William's death certificate, dated just 6 months after their wedding, listing heart failure as the cause of death and naming Esther as the sole beneficiary of his substantial estate. Sarah's phone clattered to the floor as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Everything she thought she knew about her grandmother, about her family, about the foundation of faith they'd built their lives upon, crumbled around her like the barn's rotting beams. In the sudden darkness, with only the faint moonlight filtering through gaps in the wooden walls, Sarah finally understood why Grandma Esther had kept this place locked for 60 years. The sweet, patient woman who had taught Sunday school and made the best apple pie in 3 counties had been something else entirely. She had been a monster. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Sarah approached the red barn with bolt cutters borrowed from her uncle's workshop. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned the metal jaws around the first padlock. The click of severed metal seemed to echo across the silent property, and she paused, half expecting Grandma Esther's voice to call out from beyond the grave. 3 more locks yielded to the cutters before Sarah finally stood before the weathered wooden doors. The paint had faded and peeled over the decades, but the structure remained solid. She pressed her palm against the rough wood, feeling the weight of 60 years of secrets pressing back. The doors groaned as they swung open, releasing a rush of stale air thick with dust and something else, something that made her stomach clench with unease. Shafts of sunlight pierced through gaps in the wooden slats, illuminating dancing moats and revealing the barn's interior in fragments. At first glance, it appeared ordinary enough. Old farming equipment lined one wall, a rusted plow, coils of rope, wooden crates stacked shoulder-high. But as Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed the organization was too deliberate, too careful for abandoned storage. Everything had been arranged with purpose. She pulled out her phone's flashlight and swept it across the space. The beam caught something metallic near the back of the barn, a filing cabinet, incongruous among the agricultural tools. Sarah picked her way through the maze of equipment, her footsteps muffled by decades of accumulated dust and hay. The filing cabinet was locked, but age had weakened the mechanism. A few sharp tugs broke it open, and Sarah found herself staring at rows of manila folders, each labeled with dates spanning from 1963 to 1989. Her hand shook as she pulled out the first file. Inside were newspaper clippings, all carefully cut and preserved. The headlines made her blood run cold. Local girls still missing after 2 weeks. Search called off for vanished teen. Family pleads for information about missing daughter. The photos showed young women, all blonde, all between 16 and 20 years old, all bearing an unsettling resemblance to Sarah herself. She sank onto a nearby crate, the folder trembling in her hands. There were dozens of clippings, spanning decades, documenting the disappearances of young women across 3 counties. In the margins of many articles, someone had written notes in Grandma Esther's distinctive handwriting: "Too close, move again, wait longer next time." A sound from outside made Sarah freeze. Footsteps crunched on gravel approaching the barn. She quickly stuffed the folder back into the cabinet and looked around frantically for another exit. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by voices, her Uncle David and someone else she didn't recognize. "I told you she'd figure out a way in," David was saying. "That girl's too stubborn for her own good, just like Mother was." "Then we have a problem," replied an unfamiliar male voice, deep and gravelly. "If she's seen what's in there—" "Let's not jump to conclusions," David interrupted. "Maybe she just looked around and left." Sarah pressed herself against the far wall, hidden behind a stack of crates. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she could see two figures silhouetted in the doorway. Her uncle stood with his hands on his hips, while the stranger, a tall man in a dark coat, surveyed the barn's interior. "The locks are cut," the stranger observed. "She's definitely been inside." "Sarah?" David called out. "Sarah, are you in here?" She held her breath, not daring to move. The stranger stepped into the barn, his footsteps deliberate and measured. In the filtered sunlight she caught a glimpse of his face, weathered, with cold grey eyes and a jagged scar running from his left ear to his jaw. "File cabinet's been opened," he reported, his voice carrying a note of menace that made Sarah's skin crawl. David cursed under his breath. "How much do you think she saw?" "Enough." The stranger's tone was final. "We need to find her before she talks to anyone. She's family, Marcus. She's my niece." "Your mother understood the stakes," Marcus replied coldly. "She knew what had to be done to protect the operation. The question is whether you have the same commitment." Sarah's mind raced. Operation? What operation? And how was her uncle involved in whatever Grandma Esther had been hiding all these years? "Give me time to talk to her first," David pleaded. "Maybe I can make her understand." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. 24 hours. "If she becomes a problem after that, I'll handle it my way." The two men left the barn, their voices fading as they walked back toward the house. Sarah remained frozen behind the crates for several more minutes, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she finally emerged from her hiding spot, the newspaper clippings seemed to mock her from their files, dozens of missing young women whose disappearances had somehow been connected to her beloved grandmother. And now, it seemed, Sarah herself had become a problem that needed to be handled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Sarah made her way back to the barn, a crowbar clutched in her trembling hands. She'd barely slept, haunted by images of that leather journal and the impossible date scrawled across its cover. 1962, the year her grandmother would have been barely 18, unmarried, living with her strict parents in this very house. The padlock felt heavier today, more significant. Sarah positioned the crowbar's teeth around the metal loop and pulled. The sound of splitting wood echoed across the empty fields as the lock tore free from the weathered doorframe. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped back inside. Daylight streaming through the dirty windows revealed details she'd missed in yesterday's frantic flashlight search. The makeshift nursery was more elaborate than she'd initially realized. Someone had painted tiny yellow ducks along the baseboards, their faded forms barely visible beneath decades of dust. A mobile hung motionless above the crib, its wooden animals worn smooth by countless tiny hands. Sarah approached the dresser with deliberate steps. The journal lay where she'd left it, its leather cover seeming to pulse with secrets in the morning light. She opened it with reverence, as if handling something sacred and terrible. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1962. "I can't tell Mama and Papa. They'll send me away for sure. Maybe to that home in Salt Lake where the other girls go. The shame would kill them. Brother Matthews says there are ways to handle these situations quietly, but I don't know if I'm brave enough." Sarah's mouth went dry. Brother Matthews had been the ward bishop when her grandmother was young. She remembered the stern-faced man from old family photographs. Her hands shook as she turned the page. The masculine handwriting that followed made Sarah's stomach lurch. "Esther, we'll figure this out. I promise. We can't get married before my mission. My father would disown me, and the church would never send a married man. But after, when I come back, we'll make this right." I love you, David. David. Sarah flipped through more pages, finding entries that painted a picture of two teenagers trapped between their love for each other and the suffocating expectations of their community. David left for his mission in May, promising to write, promising to return. The entries became increasingly desperate as Esther's condition became harder to hide. July 4th, 1962. Mama noticed my dress is getting tight. I told her I've been eating too much at the church socials. She looked at me strange, like she knows. I'm running out of time. August 10th, 1962. No letter from David in 3 weeks. Sister Morrison said she heard from Sister Schmidt that David's been reassigned to a different area. They do that sometimes when missionaries aren't focused on their work. Is he thinking about me at all? Sarah found herself holding her breath as she read about her grandmother's growing isolation, her terror of discovery, her desperate attempts to contact David through his family. The responses, when they came, were cold and brief. The young man who had promised to make everything right was apparently having second thoughts from thousands of miles away. September 30th, 1962, Papa found me being sick behind the house this morning. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with such disappointment. I know he knows. Mama's been crying all day. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks as she read about her grandmother's parents sending her away to stay with a distant cousin. The cover story about helping with a sick relative that would explain her absence from the community. But the most shocking revelation came in an entry dated December 3rd, 1962. She's perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and the most beautiful dark hair. The couple from Provo seem kind. They can't have children of their own, and they promise she'll be raised in the church, raised with love. I know I'm doing the right thing, but it feels like dying. I named her Rebecca, just for today, just so I could call her something that's mine. The journal slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, falling open to a page she hadn't yet read. Pressed between the yellowed papers was a hospital bracelet, tiny and pink, with baby girl Whitman printed in faded ink. Below it, an address in Provo and a phone number written in her grandmother's careful script. At the bottom of the page, in letters that seemed carved into the paper with grief, were 4 words that changed everything, in case I weaken. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the photograph closer to the dusty shaft of light filtering through the barn's grimy window. The woman in the picture bore an unmistakable resemblance to her grandmother, but the face was younger, softer somehow, framed by dark hair instead of the silver waves Sarah remembered. What made her stomach clench wasn't the familiar features, but the date scrawled on the back in faded blue ink, June 1962. That was impossible. In 1962, according to every family story Sarah had ever heard, Esther Whitman was already married to grandfather Joseph, already living on this very property with their 3 young children. Sarah's father would have been 8 years old that summer. Yet here was what appeared to be a wedding photograph of her grandmother with a completely different man. The stranger in the photo was tall and lean, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed to radiate warmth even through the yellowed paper. His arm was wrapped protectively around the woman who looked like Esther, both of them beaming at the camera with the unmistakable joy of newlyweds. Behind them stood what appeared to be a small church, its white steeple piercing a clear summer sky. Sarah sank onto the wooden crate, her mind reeling. She had attended her grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary celebration just 10 years ago. The whole family had gathered to honor Joseph and Esther's enduring marriage, their commitment to each other and to their faith. 50 years would have put their wedding in 1955, not 1962. So who was this man, and why did her grandmother look so radiantly happy beside him? A sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps crunched across the gravel driveway, slow and deliberate. Sarah quickly stuffed the photograph into her jacket pocket and moved toward the window, careful to stay in the shadows. Through the grimy glass, she could see her Uncle David walking toward the barn, his expression grim and purposeful. Panic shot through her chest. If David found her here, there would be hell to pay. She had promised her mother she would stay away from the barn until after the funeral, until the family could decide together what to do with grandmother's property. But Sarah had been unable to resist the pull of the forbidden space, especially after finding the key hidden in Esther's jewelry box. The footsteps stopped just outside the barn door. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the wall as she heard the rattle of metal against wood. David was checking the padlock, probably making sure it was still secure. She silently thanked her earlier self for having the foresight to snap it back into place after she'd entered through the side window. "Still locked tight," David muttered to himself, though Sarah wondered if he was speaking to someone else. "She never told us what was in here, and maybe that's for the best." Another voice responded, too quiet for Sarah to make out the words. Her uncle wasn't alone. She crept closer to the window and peered out, spotting her Aunt Margaret standing near the house, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the tension in her posture. "The lawyer says we need to inventory everything before we can settle the estate," Margaret called out. "That includes whatever's in that barn." "Some things are better left buried," David replied, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah's skin prickle. "Mother had her reasons for keeping us out. Those reasons died with her. We can't just ignore—" "We can, and we will." David's tone brooked no argument. "I'll take care of it myself when the time is right. But not yet. Not until we've had a chance to—" The rest of his words were lost as he walked back toward the house, leaving Sarah straining to hear. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear that her family knew more about the barn's contents than they had let on. The secrecy wasn't just about grandmother's eccentricities or her need for privacy. There was something specific they were afraid of, something they wanted to control. Sarah waited until she was certain they had gone inside before making her way back to the crate where she had found the photograph. Her fingers traced the edges of the remaining papers, finding more photographs, letters tied with ribbon, and what appeared to be official documents. Each item she examined seemed to contradict another piece of her family's carefully constructed history. The photograph in her pocket felt like it was burning against her ribs. She pulled it out again, studying the faces of the happy couple. If this really was her grandmother, then everything Sarah thought she knew about her family was a lie. But if it wasn't Esther, then why had it been hidden away so carefully, locked in a barn that no one was allowed to enter? The late afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the barn floor. Sarah knew she needed to leave soon before someone noticed her absence, but she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Not yet. Not when she was finally beginning to understand that her beloved grandmother had been keeping secrets far more profound than anyone had imagined. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled the heavy wooden box from beneath the dusty tarp. The barn's musty air seemed to thicken around her, pressing against her chest as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay stacks of photographs and documents that would change everything she thought she knew about her grandmother. She turned the photo over with shaking fingers. In Esther's careful handwriting, "Thomas and me, June 15th, 1963, our wedding day." The math didn't work. Esther had married William in 1965, according to family records. Sarah had seen their wedding photos countless times, displayed proudly in the family home. But here was evidence of another marriage, 2 years earlier, to a man whose existence had been erased from family history. Sarah dug deeper into the box, finding more photographs of Esther and Thomas. Pictures of them at what appeared to be a small farmhouse, Thomas working in a garden, while Esther watched from a porch swing. Images of intimate moments, sharing meals, dancing in what looked like this very barn. Esther's head thrown back in laughter that Sarah had rarely seen in her later years. Then she found the birth certificate. Michael Thomas Whitman, born March 3, 1964. Mother, Esther May Whitman. Father, Thomas David Whitman. Uncle Michael, the uncle who had supposedly died in infancy, whose loss had been too painful for Esther to discuss. Sarah had always been told he died of a fever when he was just 6 months old. The family had accepted this tragedy as one of those sorrows that shaped Esther's fierce protectiveness over her remaining children. But according to this birth certificate, Michael had been born a full year before Esther's supposed marriage to William, and if the documents Sarah was finding were authentic, Michael hadn't died in infancy at all. She found letters next, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Thomas's handwriting was bold and confident as he wrote to Esther about his work, his love for her, his excitement about their son's first steps, first words. The letters painted a picture of a man devoted to his family, planning for their future together. The last letter was different. Thomas's handwriting was hurried, desperate. "My darling Esther, they've found us. I have to leave tonight. Take Michael and go to your sisters. Don't try to contact me until you hear from Peterson. I love you both more than life itself. This isn't goodbye, just until it's safe. T." The letter was dated September 17th, 1964. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together the timeline. Thomas disappearing in September 1964, Michael supposedly dying that winter, Esther marrying William Whitman just months later, taking his name and somehow managing to keep it even after her first husband vanished. She found more documents buried deeper in the box. Official-looking papers with government seals, correspondence with someone named Peterson, who appeared to be some kind of federal agent. The papers referenced witness protection, testimony, and threats against Thomas's life. Fragments of a story began emerging. Thomas had witnessed something, testified about something that had put his family in danger. At the bottom of the box, Sarah discovered a manila envelope marked for Sarah in Esther's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before Esther's death. "My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've finally broken into the barn despite all my warnings. I suppose it was inevitable. You always were too curious for your own good, just like your father. There's so much I never told you, so much I couldn't tell you. Thomas didn't abandon us. He was taken. Michael didn't die of fever. He was taken too. One night in December 1964, men came to the house where we were hiding. They said Thomas had broken his agreement, that the deal was off. They took my baby and told me if I ever spoke about any of it, they'd come back for the rest of my children. I never saw either of them again. William knew everything when he married me. Good man that he was, he gave me his name and protection, helped me build a new life. But I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping that someday I'd find them both. The answers you're looking for are in Peterson's files. He's probably dead now, but his son Robert still lives in Salt Lake City. Tell him Esther Whitman sent you. Tell him it's time for the truth. Be careful, my darling girl. Some secrets have teeth." Sarah sat back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands as the magnitude of her discovery settled over her. Her grandmother hadn't been protecting family reputation or hiding some shameful past. She'd been protecting them all from something far more dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled the last photograph from beneath the floorboard. The image was different from the others, newer, in color, and far more disturbing. It showed a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, standing beside what was unmistakably the Red Barn. But this wasn't from the 1960s. The woman's clothing, her hairstyle, even the quality of the photograph screamed 1980s. The woman looked terrified. Sarah squinted at the image in the dim light filtering through the barn's grimy windows. Something about the woman's face nagged at her, a familiar curve to the jaw, the shape of the eyes. She flipped the photograph over and found writing in her grandmother's careful script, Rebecca, 1983. The last one. The last one. Sarah's blood ran cold. How many had there been? A sound outside made her freeze, the crunch of gravel under tires. Sarah quickly gathered the photographs and documents, stuffing them into her jacket pockets before moving to the window. Through the dirt-stained glass, she could see her Uncle David's blue pickup truck pulling into the driveway of the main house. She needed to get out of here, but David would see her if she tried to leave through the front of the barn. Sarah looked around desperately and spotted a small door at the back that she hadn't noticed before. It was partially hidden behind an old workbench that she managed to push aside with considerable effort. The door opened onto a narrow path that led through the woods behind the property. Sarah had never known this route existed. As she hurried along the overgrown trail, branches catching at her clothes, she wondered how many others had used this same escape route, and whether they had all made it to safety. The path emerged near the old cemetery, where generations of Whitmans lay buried. Sarah found herself standing before her grandmother's fresh grave, the headstone reading, "Esther May Whitman, beloved wife and mother, 1932 to 2023. The irony of those words now felt like a slap in the face. "What did you do, Grandma?" Sarah whispered to the headstone. "Who was Rebecca?" The name felt significant, though Sarah couldn't place it in the family tree. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found her cousin Emma, David's daughter, who lived in Portland and had always been good at genealogy research. "Emma, it's Sarah. I need to ask you something, and please don't think I'm crazy. Do you know anyone in our family named Rebecca? Maybe from the 1980s? There was a pause on the other end. "Rebecca? That's kind of a weird question, Sarah. Why? Just answer me, please. It's important." Emma's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "There was a Rebecca, my dad's sister, but we're not supposed to talk about her. She disappeared when I was really little, maybe 4 or 5. Dad said she ran away, but Mom always thought something bad happened to her." Sarah's heart pounded. "Your dad had a sister? That would make her Grandma Esther's daughter. Why don't I know about her?" "Because Grandma forbade anyone from mentioning her name after she disappeared. Said it was too painful. Rebecca was troubled, I guess. Dad said she was always getting into fights with Grandma about everything. The last time anyone saw her, she was supposed to be going to college in California, but she never made it there. The police said she probably just wanted to start fresh somewhere new." But Sarah knew better now. Rebecca hadn't run away to California. She had been in that barn, terrified, in 1983. And according to Grandma Esther's note, she was the last one. "Emma, I need you to do something for me. Can you look up any missing person reports from 1983, specifically for Rebecca Whitman?" "Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Before Sarah could answer, she heard voices coming from the direction of the barn. Male voices, and they sounded agitated. She crouched behind her grandmother's headstone and listened. Door was forced open. "Someone's been in there. Check if anything's missing. You know what to look for." Sarah recognized her Uncle David's voice, but the other man was unfamiliar. Her pulse quickened as she realized they would soon discover the disturbed floorboard and the missing photographs. "Emma, I have to go. But please, look up that missing person report, and don't tell anyone we had this conversation." Sarah ended the call and carefully made her way deeper into the cemetery, using the larger headstones as cover. She needed to get back to her car, but it was parked near the house, and David would certainly see her. As she crept between the graves of her ancestors, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if Rebecca was buried here too, in some unmarked spot, her disappearance covered up by the very woman the family had revered as a saint. The manila folder trembled in Sarah's hands as she spread the contents across the dusty workbench. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, formed a mosaic of horror that made her stomach lurch. The headlines screamed across decades: "Local girl missing," "Search continues for Rebecca Morrison," "Family pleads for information." Sarah's hands shook as she picked up another clipping. This one dated 3 months after Rebecca's disappearance. "Morrison family moves away, citing unbearable grief." The accompanying photo showed a hollow-eyed couple loading boxes into a moving truck, a smaller headline noting they were relocating to Oregon to start fresh. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, knocking over a paint can that clattered across the wooden floor. The sound echoed in the oppressive silence, but it couldn't drown out the roaring in her ears. Her grandmother, sweet, church-going Esther, who baked cookies for the neighbors and never missed a Sunday service, had been a monster. Sarah forced herself to look at more of the evidence, though every instinct screamed at her to run. There were drawings in a child's handwriting, crayon sketches of stick figures and houses with the name Rebecca scrawled in uneven letters across the top. A small pink hair ribbon, still tied in a perfect bow. A wooden toy horse, its paint worn smooth by small fingers. In the very back of the folder, Sarah found what looked like journal entries written in her grandmother's precise script. Her vision blurred as she read the first few lines. Day 12. She stopped crying for her mother. I told her the story about the little girl who lived in the forest again. She seems to like that one. Day 18. Made her favorite soup today. Chicken noodle. She ate 3 bowls. Her color is getting better. Day 23. She asked about going home again. I explained that this is her home now. She doesn't understand yet, but she will. The entries continued for months, documenting a twisted domesticity that made Sarah's skin crawl. Esther had written about Rebecca like she was a beloved pet, noting her eating habits, her moods, the games they played together. There was no acknowledgement that she'd stolen a child from her family, destroyed countless lives with her actions. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. A text from Marcus. Everything okay? You've been gone for hours. Hours? Had it really been that long? Sarah looked around the barn with new eyes, seeing it not as a repository of mysterious secrets, but as a crime scene. How many times had her family gathered just yards away for barbecues and birthday parties, while Rebecca Morrison's remains lay hidden beneath their feet? She thought about all the stories Esther used to tell, the family legends passed down like precious heirlooms, how Esther had overcome hardship to build their farm from nothing, how she'd single-handedly raised Sarah's father after his own mother died in childbirth, how she'd been the rock that held them all together through good times and bad. All lies built on a foundation of unspeakable horror. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was her father. Hey, sweetie. Just wanted to remind you about the memorial service on Sunday. Mom's making her famous potato salad. Grandma would have loved having everyone together. The irony was suffocating. Sarah stared at the message until the words blurred together, thinking about her grandmother's funeral just 2 weeks ago, the packed church, the tearful eulogies, the endless stream of people sharing stories about Esther's kindness and generosity. The pastor had called her a woman of unwavering faith and boundless love. What would those people think if they knew the truth? What would her father think? Her mother? Her cousins who'd driven hundreds of miles to pay their respects? Sarah carefully gathered the newspaper clippings and photographs, her movements mechanical and precise. She had to think clearly, had to decide what to do with this information. Rebecca Morrison's parents might still be alive, still wondering what happened to their little girl. They deserved answers, but giving them those answers would destroy her own family in the process. As she stood in that dusty barn, surrounded by the detritus of her grandmother's terrible secret, Sarah realized she was facing an impossible choice: justice for a murdered child or protection for the living family who'd unknowingly built their entire identity around a lie. The weight of that decision settled on her shoulders like a shroud, and for the first time since entering the barn, Sarah understood why her grandmother had fought so hard to keep this door locked forever. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead as Sarah sat across from Detective Martinez, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The recording device on the table between them seemed to pulse with each second of silence. "Walk me through it again," Martinez said, his pen poised over a yellow legal pad. From the beginning. Sarah's throat felt raw from 3 hours of questioning. She'd told the story so many times now that the words felt foreign in her mouth. Finding the barn, the photographs, the newspaper clippings, and finally the discovery that had brought them all here, the small grave beneath the loose floorboards. "I went to the barn because I was cleaning out Grandma Esther's house," she began again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found the key in her sewing box." Martinez nodded, making notes. Through the one-way glass, Sarah could see her reflection, hollow-eyed, her usually neat blonde hair disheveled. She looked like a stranger to herself. And you'd never been inside before? Never. Grandma made sure of that. Sarah's mind drifted to childhood memories of birthday parties in the backyard, how Esther would always position the picnic tables so they faced away from the barn. How she'd invented elaborate games to keep the grandchildren occupied on the opposite side of the property. The door opened, and Detective Chen entered with a manila folder. She exchanged a meaningful look with Martinez before sitting down. "Sarah, we've gotten some preliminary results back," Chen said gently. "The remains you found, they're those of an infant, probably no more than a few days old." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd suspected as much when she'd seen the tiny bones, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach lurch. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. "We also found this," Chen continued, sliding a plastic evidence bag across the table. Inside was a yellowed birth certificate, carefully preserved. Sarah leaned forward to read it, and her world tilted again. The baby's name was listed as James Whitman, born March 15, 1963. Mother, Esther May Whitman. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "My grandfather died in 1962, and Grandma never mentioned having another child after my father." Chen and Martinez exchanged another look. "Sarah, there's something else. We've been in contact with the hospital where this birth certificate was issued. According to their records, your grandmother checked herself in under a false name. She paid in cash and left the same night the baby was born." Sarah's mind reeled. A secret child, born after her grandfather's death, hidden away then... What? The barn suddenly seemed less like a shrine and more like a tomb. "We need to ask you about your grandmother's mental state in her later years," Martinez said carefully. "Did she ever mention feeling guilty about anything? Ever talk about keeping secrets?" The question unlocked a flood of memories Sarah had pushed aside. Esther's increasingly erratic behavior in her 80s. The way she'd pace the house at night, muttering to herself. How she'd sometimes forget where she was and ask Sarah to forgive her for things she never explained. "She had dementia," Sarah said slowly. "Towards the end she'd get confused. Sometimes she'd call me by my father's name, and she'd..." Sarah paused, remembering. "She'd beg me not to let them take the baby away." Chen leaned forward. "Did she say who they were?" "I thought she was confused, mixing up memories of when my father was born, maybe." Sarah's voice cracked. But what if she wasn't confused at all? The detectives let that hang in the air for a moment. Through the small window, Sarah could see the sun setting, painting the sky the same deep red as the barn that had hidden these secrets for 60 years. "There's one more thing," Chen said, opening the folder. "We found medical records from 1963. Your grandmother sought treatment for severe postpartum depression after this birth. The doctor's notes mention intrusive thoughts about harming the infant and extreme paranoia about authorities removing the child. She was protecting him," Sarah said, tears finally coming. In her mind, she was protecting him from being taken away. Even if... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what they all now understood, that sometimes protection and harm could wear the same face, that love and tragedy could be separated by the thinnest of lines. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Sarah wondered how many other secrets lay buried in the shadows of families who thought they knew everything about the people they loved most. The flashlight beam trembled in Sarah's hand as she read the final entry in Esther's journal, dated just 3 weeks before her grandmother's death. The words seemed to burn themselves into her retinas. "In the truth will die with me. Sarah must never know what I've done." But Sarah did know now. Everything. The sound of gravel crunching outside made her freeze. Car doors slammed and she heard Uncle David's voice carrying across the yard, sharp with authority. "Check the house first. If she's not there, we'll try the barn." "Sarah!" David's voice was closer now, maybe 20 yards away. "We know you're out here. We just want to talk." She didn't believe that for a second. Not after what she'd discovered about the Mitchell family. Not after learning that her grandmother hadn't been protecting a family secret, she'd been protecting a crime. Sarah crept toward the back of the barn, stepping carefully around the old farm equipment. Her foot caught on something metal and a tool clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the barn like a gunshot. The voices outside went silent. Then David's footsteps, running now. "She's in the barn!" Sarah bolted for the back door, abandoning stealth for speed. Her shoulder slammed into the doorframe as she burst outside, and she stumbled but kept running. Behind her, she heard the barn door crash open. "There!" That was Thomas's voice. "She's heading for the woods." The tree line was 50 yards away across the back pasture. Sarah ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, her lungs burning in the cold night air. The journal slapped against her chest with each stride, a reminder of everything at stake. A flashlight beam swept across her, and she heard David curse. They were gaining on her. She reached the woods and plunged into the darkness between the trees. Branches whipped at her face and caught in her hair, but she pushed deeper into the forest. She knew these woods from childhood, every trail, every landmark. It was her only advantage. Behind her, the flashlight beams bobbed through the trees like angry fireflies. David and Thomas were crashing through the underbrush, making no attempt at stealth. "You can't run forever, Sarah," David called out. "Come back, and we'll explain everything." Explain everything. As if there could be any explanation for what Esther had done to the Mitchell children. As if 60 years of lies could be justified by family loyalty. Sarah veered left toward the old creek bed, moving by memory and instinct. The darkness was complete under the canopy, but she knew the way. She'd played here as a child while Esther watched from the porch, never suspecting that her grandmother was harboring the darkest of secrets. The creek was running high from recent rains, and Sarah splashed across without hesitation. The icy water soaked through her shoes and jeans, but she barely felt it. On the other side, she paused to listen. The pursuit had fallen behind. She could hear David and Thomas arguing in harsh whispers, their voices carrying across the water. "We should have handled this differently," Thomas was saying. "It's too late for that now," David replied. "She knows too much." The casual menace in her uncle's voice made Sarah's skin crawl. These were men who'd grown up calling her grandmother Aunt Esther, who'd sat at her dinner table and praised her cooking. Now they were hunting Sarah through the woods like an animal. She moved deeper into the forest, following the creek downstream. A quarter-mile ahead, the water passed under County Road 15. If she could reach the road, she might be able to flag down a car. But then what? Who would believe her story? The journal was evidence, but would it be enough? Esther's handwriting was shaky in the final entries, and a good lawyer could argue that an elderly woman's confused ramblings weren't reliable testimony. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text message. She ducked behind a fallen log and carefully shielded the screen as she checked it. The message was from an unknown number. "Stop running. We have your mother." Sarah's world tilted sideways. Her mother was supposed to be safe in Phoenix, 3 states away. How could they possibly? Another message appeared, and parking lot behind Murphy's diner. "Come alone, or she dies." Sarah sank to her knees in the damp leaves, the phone trembling in her hands. The journal suddenly felt impossibly heavy against her chest. All her plans to expose the truth, to get justice for the Mitchell family. None of it mattered now. They had her mother. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph, studying the faces that seemed to stare back at her across decades of silence. The woman in the center bore an unmistakable resemblance to Esther, but younger, her eyes holding a hardness that Sarah had never seen in her grandmother's gentle gaze. Standing beside her were 3 men in what appeared to be military uniforms, though not from any branch Sarah recognized. The journal entry beneath the photograph was dated September 15, 1962, written in Esther's careful script. "They came again today. Harold thinks we should tell them everything, but I know better. Some secrets are worth dying for. Some are worth killing for." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she flipped through more pages, each entry painting a picture of a woman she'd never known. This wasn't the loving grandmother who had baked cookies and told bedtime stories. This was someone else entirely, someone who spoke of operations and eliminations with clinical detachment. The barn door creaked behind her, and Sarah spun around to find her father standing in the entrance, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. "I was wondering when you'd finally break in here," he said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I've been expecting this day for 20 years. Dad, what is all this?" Sarah gestured to the documents scattered around her. "These pictures, these journal entries, they're talking about Grandma like she was some kind of spy." He finished the sentence she couldn't bring herself to say. "Because she was, Sarah. Your grandmother worked for the CIA for nearly 2 decades. The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah sank onto an old wooden crate, the journal still clutched in her hands. "That's impossible. She was a housewife, a mother. She taught Sunday school." Her father moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "All true. But before that, before she met your grandfather and settled down, she was one of the most effective, deep-cover operatives the agency ever had. The perfect cover. A sweet Mormon girl from Utah who could infiltrate anywhere without raising suspicion." Sarah stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was some elaborate joke. "How long have you known? But why keep all this?" Sarah held up the journal. "Why not destroy it?" "Insurance," he said grimly. "There were things that happened, operations that went wrong. People died, Sarah. Important people. Your grandmother knew too much, and some of her former colleagues thought she might be a liability. These documents were her guarantee that if anything happened to her or our family, the truth would come out." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process everything. The grandmother she'd idolized, who had taught her about kindness and forgiveness, had been living a lie for 60 years. What kind of operations? Her father was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, the kind that don't make it into history books. Assassinations, infiltrations, psychological warfare. The Cold War wasn't just fought with missiles and armies, Sarah. It was fought in the shadows by people like your grandmother. A new thought struck her, more terrifying than the rest. "Is that why she died? You said some people thought she was a liability. The doctors said it was natural causes. Heart failure." But something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, though I'll admit the timing was coincidental. She'd been getting phone calls in the weeks before she died. Hang-ups mostly, but a few times I heard her speaking in what sounded like code. Sarah felt sick. Everything she thought she knew about her family, about her grandmother, was crumbling around her. "What do we do now? Do we tell Mom? The rest of the family?" "That's up to you," her father said. "You're the one who opened this door. But understand that once this gets out, there's no going back. Your grandmother spent 60 years building a new life, a new identity. She genuinely became the woman you knew and loved. But there are still people out there who only remember who she used to be." The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. In her hands, she held the power to destroy her family's peace or preserve a lie that had protected them for decades. She thought about her children, about the stories they'd told about their great-grandmother, about the legacy they believed they'd inherited. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, casting the barn in deeper shadow. Sarah realized that whatever choice she made in this moment would echo through the generations, just as Esther's choices had echoed down to her. The secret had been kept for 60 years. The question now was whether it would survive another day. "Mom, you need to see this." Sarah's voice cracked as she called down from the barn's loft. Margaret climbed the creaking ladder, her face pale in the dusty light filtering through the warped boards. When she saw the photograph, she sank onto an old crate, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. "Mother only had 4 children. She told us a lot of things." Sarah rifled through more documents scattered across the floor. Birth certificates, adoption papers, letters written in Esther's careful script. "Look at this. Timothy, age 7, Rebecca, age 6, James, age 5, all signed over to the state of Utah in 1963. Margaret's face went ashen. 1963. That was the year before she married Dad. She said she'd never been married before, that we were her only family. Sarah found more photographs tucked inside a leather portfolio. Images of Esther as a young woman, maybe 25, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and calloused hands. In one photo, she was visibly pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. In another, she held 2 infants, twins by the look of them. "Oh my God," Margaret breathed. How many children did she have? The answer came in the form of a journal, its pages yellow with age. Sarah opened it carefully, reading aloud from Esther's younger handwriting, "Robert died in the mine collapse today. The children don't understand why Daddy isn't coming home. I don't know how I'll feed them all. The church says there are good families who want children, families who can provide what I cannot." Margaret snatched the journal, her eyes scanning the pages frantically. She gave them away. She gave away her own children because she couldn't afford to keep them after their father died. There's more. Sarah held up a manila envelope marked with the state seal. She tried to get them back. Multiple times. These are court documents from 1965, 1967, 1972. She fought for years, but the adoptions were finalized. She never saw them again. The weight of discovery settled over them like dust motes in the stale air. Sarah understood now why Esther had been so fiercely protective of her remaining family, why she'd clung to Margaret and later to Sarah and her siblings with an intensity that sometimes felt suffocating. She'd already lost 5 children to poverty and circumstance. "Here." Margaret's voice was barely audible as she handed Sarah another document. A death certificate. Rebecca Whitman, age 16, died in a car accident in 1973. Sarah felt sick. One of Esther's lost children had died while still a teenager, and Esther had never even known. The cruelty of it was staggering. "This explains the money," Margaret said suddenly. "The inheritance she left us. Look at these bank statements. She'd been putting money aside for years, thousands of dollars. There are notes in the margins, Timothy's college fund, Rebecca's wedding dress, James's mission fund. She was still providing for them, even though they were gone." Sarah found herself crying for a grandmother she thought she'd known completely. Every harsh word, every moment of seeming coldness, every time Esther had pulled family too close, it all made sense now. She'd been a young widow who'd made an impossible choice, then spent the rest of her life trying to atone for it. "We have to find them," Sarah said, "the ones who are still alive." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Timothy would be 62 now. James, 60. They might have children of their own, grandchildren. We might have family we've never met. They spent the rest of the afternoon cataloguing Esther's secrets. Letters she'd written but never sent, birthday cards for children who would never receive them, Christmas gifts wrapped and stored for decades. The barn wasn't just a repository of shame, it was a shrine to love that had nowhere to go. As the sun began to set, painting the barn's interior in shades of amber and gold, Sarah understood why Esther had locked this place away. Not because she was ashamed of her choices, but because the pain of remembering was too much to bear. Every item in this barn represented a piece of her heart that had been torn away. "She protected us from this," Margaret said softly, "from knowing how much she'd lost. She didn't want us to carry her grief." But Sarah realized that keeping secrets had been its own kind of burden. Esther had carried this pain alone for 60 years, letting it fester in the darkness of the old red barn while she built a new life on its foundation. The photographs scattered across the barn floor told a story Sarah never could have imagined. Her hands trembled as she gathered them, each image a piece of a puzzle that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her grandmother. Esther wasn't just the devoted Mormon wife and mother they'd all believed her to be. She had been someone else entirely, someone with secrets that ran deeper than the foundation of their family's faith. In the fading afternoon light filtering through the barn's dusty windows, Sarah studied the images more carefully. There was Esther, young and radiant, standing beside a man who definitely wasn't Grandfather William. The stranger's arm wrapped around her waist with an intimacy that spoke of more than friendship. Other photos showed Esther in places Sarah had never heard her mention: a jazz club in Chicago, a beach house in California, city streets filled with people and life that seemed worlds away from their quiet Utah community. But it was the documents hidden beneath the photographs that made Sarah's blood run cold. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, all bearing Esther's name, but with different dates, different places, different identities. Sarah's grandmother hadn't just had secrets, she had lived entire other lives. The barn door creaked behind her, and Sarah spun around to find her mother standing in the doorway. Rebecca's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the papers in Sarah's hands. "You weren't supposed to find those," Rebecca said quietly. "You knew?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You knew about all of this?" Rebecca stepped into the barn, closing the door behind her. "Not everything, but I knew enough." She moved closer, her gaze taking in the scattered evidence of Esther's hidden past. "I found some of it years ago, when I was about your age. Mother caught me snooping and made me promise never to speak of it." Rebecca's shoulders sagged. "I know. Then why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I was protecting our family." Rebecca's voice carried a weight of years, of decisions made and consequences lived with. "Because sometimes the truth does more harm than good." Sarah stared at her mother, seeing a stranger. "That's not your choice to make, isn't it?" Rebecca moved to one of the old wooden crates and sat down heavily. "Do you have any idea what this would do to your father, to your Uncle David, to the entire community that looked up to Mother as an example of faith and devotion? Some truths are too dangerous to tell. But what if the truth is connected to what happened to Emma Rodriguez?" Sarah's words hung in the air between them. "What if grandmother's past is the reason someone killed that woman?" Rebecca's face went white. "What are you talking about?" Sarah pulled out the letter she'd found, the one with Emma's name on it, the one that had been hidden among Esther's most secret possessions. Emma Rodriguez was investigating grandmother. She'd been asking questions about her past, about things that didn't add up. And now Emma's dead. That's impossible. But even as Rebecca said it, Sarah could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. "Is it? Look at these documents, Mom. Look at the dates. Grandmother was married to someone else before she married grandfather William, someone she never divorced. That makes her a bigamist. And look at this." Sarah held up a birth certificate with a different name entirely. Who was Esther Whitman, really? Rebecca took the document with shaking hands. "I don't understand." "Neither do I. But Emma Rodriguez was trying to find out. And now she's dead." Sarah gathered more of the papers, her mind racing. "There's something else here, something worth killing for." The two women spent the next hour going through everything in the crate, piece by piece. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had reinvented herself multiple times, leaving behind identities like shed skin. There were references to places Sarah had never heard Esther mention, people who seemed to vanish from her life as completely as if they'd never existed. "Here," Rebecca said suddenly, holding up a small address book. "Look at this." The book was filled with names and addresses, but what caught Sarah's attention was the notation system Esther had used. Next to some names were symbols, crosses, stars, numbers that seemed to correspond to dates. It looked almost like a code. "She was keeping track of something," Sarah murmured. "Or someone." Rebecca flipped through the pages, stopping at an entry that made her gasp. "Sarah, look at this name." There, written in Esther's careful handwriting, was Emma Rodriguez's name. Next to it was an address, a phone number, and a symbol that appeared nowhere else in the book, a small drawing of what looked like a key. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the final journal entry, the ink still fresh enough to smudge under her fingertips. Esther had written these words just days before her death, a confession that cut deeper than any secret hidden in the barn's shadows. "I have watched my family build their lives on the foundation of lies I constructed. Each Sunday sermon Jacob preaches, each prayer circle Sarah leads, each moment of faith they embrace, all of it rests on the bones of my deception. I am dying, and I am a coward. I cannot bear to see their faces when they learn the truth, yet I cannot bear to take this secret to my grave. Let the barn keep its vigil a little longer. Let someone else be brave enough to tear down what I built." The words blurred as tears gathered in Sarah's eyes. Behind her, she could hear Michael pacing among the hidden artifacts, his breathing sharp and irregular. They'd spent 3 hours in the barn now, piecing together 60 years of carefully constructed fiction. "She never converted," Michael said finally, his voice hollow. "All those years of leading our family in prayer, of being the spiritual cornerstone we all looked up to, she was living a lie." Sarah wiped her eyes and turned to face the wall where Esther's real life was displayed like a museum exhibit. Photographs of her with colleagues at the university, where she had secretly completed her doctorate. Letters from academic publishers who had printed her research under a male pseudonym. Articles she had written about women's rights, about the dangers of religious extremism, about the importance of education for girls, all published in journals that the Mormon community would have condemned. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, pointing to a framed certificate half hidden behind a stack of books. She was awarded a PhD in sociology from the University of Utah in 1967. She had a whole other life. Michael picked up a letter dated from the 1980s, scanning its contents with growing disbelief. She was funding scholarship programs for young women who wanted to leave restrictive religious communities. She was helping them escape. The barn felt smaller now, heavy with the weight of revelation. Sarah understood why Esther had locked this away, why she had chosen threats and fear over truth. This wasn't just about one woman's secret life. It was about the systematic dismantling of everything their family had believed about faith, about women's roles, about the very foundation of their community. She was protecting them, Sarah realized, her voice barely audible. All those young women who disappeared from our community over the years, the ones the elders said, had been led astray by worldly influences. Esther was helping them leave. A manila folder tucked behind the photographs contained the evidence, bank records showing regular payments to various women's shelters and educational programs, correspondence with social workers, and most damning of all, a list of names. Sarah recognized several of them, young women who had vanished from their congregation, their families left to mourn their spiritual deaths. Michael sank into the wooden chair, his face pale. Jenny Morrison. She was 17 when she disappeared. Her parents held a funeral service, said she was dead to them for abandoning her faith. "According to this," Sarah said, reading from Esther's careful notes, "Jenny graduated from nursing school and works at a hospital in California. She's married. She has children." The implications crashed over them like a wave. If Esther had been helping women escape, if she had been living a double life for decades, what did that say about the community that had revered her? What did it say about the faith that had shaped their entire family? "We have to tell them," Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. From what? The truth? From having their entire worldview shattered? Sarah gestured to the evidence surrounding them. "How do we go home and tell our families that the woman they worshipped was secretly undermining everything they believe in? How do we explain that their faith has been guided by someone who thought it was dangerous?" The afternoon light filtering through the barn's single window had shifted, casting long shadows across their grandmother's hidden legacy. Outside, Sarah could hear the distant sound of vehicles approaching. The family had finally come looking for them. Time was running out, and they still had no answers, only more devastating questions that threatened to destroy everything they had ever known about love, faith, and the woman who had shaped their lives. The police cruiser's headlights swept across the farmhouse as Detective Morrison pulled into the gravel driveway. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, her hands trembling as she gripped the yellowed birth certificate. Behind her, the open shoebox sat on the table like Pandora's box, its contents now impossible to contain. "Sarah, you don't have to do this," her mother whispered, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "We could burn everything. Pretend we never found it." "No, Mom. We can't live with this secret like Grandma did." Sarah turned away from the window. Look what it did to her. Look what it did to all of us." The knock on the door echoed through the house with the finality of a judge's gavel. Sarah's father, who had driven over in stunned silence after their phone call, sat motionless at the kitchen table. His face had aged a decade in the past hour, the weight of understanding what his mother had done pressing down on him like a physical force. Sarah opened the door to find Detective Morrison's weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Whitman, you said this was about the Hendricks family? Please come in." Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "There's something we need to show you." Morrison followed her into the kitchen, his eyes immediately drawn to the shoebox and its scattered contents. Photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings created a timeline of deception that spanned 6 decades. He pulled out a small notebook, his expression growing more serious as Sarah began to speak. "My grandmother, Esther Whitman, she took a baby that wasn't hers." The words felt like glass in Sarah's throat. In 1963, during the ice storm, the Hendricks family died in the car accident, but their infant daughter survived. Grandma found the wreck first, and instead of reporting it, she took the baby and claimed it was her own stillborn child who had miraculously survived. Morrison's pen stopped moving. "Are you saying your father is Rebecca Hendricks?" Sarah's father said quietly, his voice hollow. "I'm not a Whitman at all." The detective studied the birth certificate Sarah handed him, then picked up one of the newspaper clippings. The headline read, "Local family perishes in ice storm tragedy." Below it, a smaller article announced the miraculous survival of Esther Whitman's newborn son after initial reports of stillbirth. "The medical records?" Morrison asked. Sarah's mother stepped forward. "Forged. Esther's husband worked at the county office. They falsified everything. The birth certificate, the medical records, even the death certificates for the Hendricks family. They listed the baby as deceased along with his parents." Morrison set down his notebook and rubbed his temples. This is one hell of an accusation. What made you look into this?" "The barn," Sarah said. "After Grandma died, I found all of this hidden in the barn she'd kept locked for 60 years. There are more things. Baby clothes that don't match our family photos, medical records showing Grandma couldn't have had children after 1960, letters she never sent to relatives of the Hendricks family." The detective picked up a faded photograph of a young couple holding an infant. On the back, in careful script, "Rebecca's first Christmas, Thomas and Mary Hendricks, 1962. "Jesus," Morrison breathed. "The Hendricks case has been cold for decades. There were always questions about why the baby's body was never found at the crash site, but the assumption was that it had been thrown from the vehicle and, well, with all that snow and the animals." Sarah's father looked up with haunted eyes. "She told me my whole life that I was a miracle baby, that God had brought me back from the brink of death. I believed her. We all did." "The religious community rallied around the story," Sarah's mother added. "It became part of church folklore, the baby who survived against all odds through divine intervention. Esther became something of a local saint." Morrison gathered the documents carefully. "I'm going to need to take these as evidence. There'll be an investigation, DNA test to confirm what you've found. The state's attorney will have to decide how to proceed, given that everyone directly involved except your father is deceased." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we try to piece together the truth. We'll need to contact any surviving Hendricks relatives, if there are any. This will likely make the news. A story this big, involving a family as prominent in the community as yours." He let the sentence hang unfinished. As Morrison loaded the evidence into his car, Sarah stood in the doorway watching her family's reputation drive away into the darkness. Tomorrow, the name Whitman would be synonymous with scandal instead of sanctity. The woman who had been revered as a pillar of faith and community would be remembered as something else entirely. But tonight, for the first time in 60 years, the truth was finally free. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as Sarah stood beside her grandmother's freshly filled grave. 3 weeks had passed since she'd first entered the Red Barn, 3 weeks since her world had shattered and slowly begun to rebuild itself into something she could finally understand. Self-defense, Martinez had concluded, after reviewing all the evidence Sarah had provided. Your grandfather's journal entries, the police reports from that era about Crawford's history of violence against women, the positioning of the remains, it all supports your grandmother's account. Sarah clutched the small wooden box containing her grandmother's final letter, the one she'd found hidden behind a loose board in the barn's wall. In it, Esther had written the complete truth about that terrible night, how James Crawford had forced his way into their home while her husband was away, how he'd attacked her, and how she'd fought back with the fireplace poker, how she'd carried the weight of taking a life, even in self-defense, for 60 years. I was 19 and terrified, the letter had read. The law didn't protect women like it should have then. I was afraid no one would believe me, afraid they'd take me away from my babies, so I made a choice that haunted me every day since. The letter had gone on to explain how Esther had buried Crawford's body in the barn, how she'd spent decades living with the fear that someone would discover her secret, how she'd kept her family away from that place not out of cruelty, but out of love, protecting them from a truth she thought would destroy their faith in her. Sarah's cousin David approached, his wife Rebecca at his side. The family had gathered that morning not just to mourn, but to decide what would happen next. The truth was out now, spreading through their community like ripples in a pond. Some relatives had reacted with shock and disappointment. Others, particularly the women, had quietly expressed understanding of the impossible position Esther had found herself in. The barn's been cleared, David said softly. The county's released the property back to us. Sarah nodded. They'd agreed to tear it down, to let that chapter of their family's history finally close. But first, they'd saved what mattered. The quilts Esther had hidden there, each one telling a story of the woman she'd truly been. Not perfect, not without secrets, but human and complex and ultimately loving. I keep thinking about what she must have carried all these years, Rebecca said, her voice heavy with emotion. The guilt, the fear, it explains so much about why she was the way she was. Sarah thought about her grandmother's stern exterior, her rigid rules, her desperate need to control everything around her. Now she understood it had all been armor, protection against a world that felt dangerous and unpredictable. She tried to tell me once, Sarah realized aloud. Last Christmas, she started to say something about mistakes and forgiveness. I thought she was just being philosophical. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers on the grave, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not closure exactly, but acceptance. Her grandmother had been imperfect, had made choices that seemed impossible to understand from the outside. But she'd also been a survivor, a protector, a woman who'd done what she thought necessary to keep her family safe. The criminal investigation was closed, the case officially resolved. Crawford's family, what remained of them, had been notified. There would be no charges, no trial, no public condemnation of a 19-year-old girl who'd fought for her life 6 decades ago. As the family began to disperse, Sarah remained by the gravestone. She pulled out the letter, one more time, reading the final paragraph that had brought her the most peace. If you're reading this, it means I found the courage to leave you the truth before I died. I pray you'll understand that everything I did, right or wrong, came from love. Take the good things I taught you and forgive the rest. Don't let my secrets become your burden. Live freely, my dear granddaughter. Live without fear. As she walked away from the grave, Sarah felt the weight of 60 years of secrets lift from her shoulders, carried away on the morning wind.